Face as important of an issue as we've had certainly since I've been here, possibly decades. A deal with the devil is what it comes down to. A deal with what Ronald Reagan would say is evil. It makes the evil empire of the Soviet Union pale in comparison to the evil that Iran's leaders have perpetuated. And this administration has done a deal with them. Chairman Ed Royce has eloquently pointed out that Iran has violated every international agreement they've entered since 1979. So wouldn't it fill the definition of insanity if another deal is entered by what used to be the lone superpower with the one and only country in existence right now in the world that has broken every agreement it's entered since 1979? If someone were standing back as a historian and looking at what's going on right now, and we're totally objective, he or she would probably say, well, it looks like the fools running the United States are going to get what they deserve. They've made a deal with sheer evil. These evil leaders have lied. They've broken every agreement they've ever entered. And these fools running the United States are going to get what they deserve. It's going to happen again. People are going to die in greater numbers than ever before. And what grieves me more than anything is what seems to be the idea of some in the House and Senate that, gee, since Iran's going to get nuclear weapons, surely they're going to cheat. They're going to get them. They're going to get them sooner rather than later. This deal is not going to allow anybody to stop them. So what's important here is to provide political cover to Republicans. And we can do that acting like we're fighting real hard in the House, acting like we're fighting real hard in the Senate. Then we lose. Then when Iran gets nukes and kills hundreds of thousands or millions of people, say, see, we told you we did what we could. But the trouble is that's not good enough, because lives in this country and the nation of Israel are all at stake here. We've been told that, the 15 nations heading up the UN Security Council, they've agreed, so it should be binding against the United States. That argument was attempted to be made by the Secretary of State and the President himself, that, we have to go along because the UN's already voted. Well, yeah, that would be true if there were not something called the United States Constitution, under which our first president under the Constitution took office in 1789. And since this has been in effect, our U.S. Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, second paragraph has been in effect. He, talking about the President, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Very clear. And we also know, it's very clear, that you cannot have a treaty like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the international agreement that was lauded by so many over such a long period of time. You cannot amend an international treaty like that unless it's with another treaty. You cannot amend that with an executive agreement. You cannot amend that with an agreement that's non-binding. Therefore, it's pretty clear, it's exceedingly clear, that what the President and Secretary Kerry and Wendy Sherman that did such a good job helping with the North Korea deal, so they got nuclear weapons. They say it's not a treaty, but absolutely it is a treaty. So if we're going to uphold our oath of office, we have to acknowledge that this is a treaty and implore the Senate to announce that even though the President has not submitted this treaty to them for ratification under Article 2, since it is a treaty, they have the power to bring it up. And yes, there's a convenient Senate rule called cloture that Harry Reid actually suspended numerous times in the matter of some confirmations so they could get judges on the bench that would uphold whatever interpretation of the Constitution this administration cared to bring before them. But there is a time when the Republicans in the Senate must say, you know what, this is too important to let a gaggle of minority senators from the minority party keep us from voting on the most important bill of our time. We're not going to let a rule that we make, that we put in place, that we can suspend, keep us from having a vote on the most important bill of our time, the treaty with Iran. So the Senate can suspend, as Harry Reid did, suspend the cloture rule with a vote of 51 senators. And once they have the 51 that suspend cloture in this Iranian treaty, then bring the treaty to the floor for a ratification vote. It will not get 2/3. And then once and for all time, it will be clear to everyone, except perhaps the President and Secretary Kerry, it will be very clear, as it is to constitutional law professors I've talked to, it will be very clear that we are not bound by the Iranian treaty with the only country in the world that has broken every international agreement they've had since 1979. So, the resolution that I had filed, numerous great co-sponsors, it points out that the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015, that's the Corker-Cardin bill, does not apply to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action regarding Iran, that's the Iran Treaty, submitted to Congress on July 19, 2015, because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is a treaty. And pursuant to Article 2 of the United States Constitution, the Senate must give its advice and consent to ratification if the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is to be effective and binding upon the United States. Also states, because it's a fact, on March 11, 2015, Secretary of State John, describing the administration's nuclear negotiations with Iran, clearly stated that it was, quote, not negotiating a legally binding plan, unquote, with Iran, and therefore it does not have to be submitted to Congress. If it were not legally binding, then no, Secretary Kerry and the President do not have to submit it to Congress. But the President and the Secretary of State have already given this facade, this charade away, because they've already said, well, gee, if Congress doesn't go along with it, we will be in breach of the agreement because the UN's already voted on it. Aha! You said it wasn't legally binding what you were negotiating, and now you're telling us that's not true. I mean, it conjures up memories of other statements like, if you like your insurance, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. It conjures up sermons and how we had to take out Gaddafi out of Libya for stability of the area. It would make the place so much better in North Africa, and we saw what happened. Gaddafi would not have been removed without President Obama bombing on behalf of the rebels that were infused with al-Qaeda that would end up ultimately attacking our consulate in Benghazi and killing 4 Americans. And we now see, as I did last week when I was in North Africa, this president, this State Department has created massive instability across North Africa. It has put millions and tens of millions of people in fear. Where do you think this crazy migration started from? It started from the policies of this president in declaring that something that they love calling the Arab Spring, but ended up becoming a cold, harsh killer of a winter, was going to be helped along by the United States. Some in North Africa reminded me of our president's statement that Mubarak had to go. President declared he has to go. He interfered with what was going on in Egypt. He interfered with an ally, not a great guy at all. But he created massive instability that allowed the Muslim brother, Morsi, to take over. And yes, he was elected. Yes, as confirmed again this past week, there were plenty of fraudulent votes. He alleged to have had 12 million or so votes. But after a year as president of usurping the power under the Constitution, totally disregarding the Constitution, taking powers that weren't his, moving to become dictator, over 30 million Egyptians rose up, went to the street. These were moderate Muslims. These were secularists, Christians, Jews that came to the streets and said with one accord, one heart, one voice, we don't want radical Islamists running Egypt. Same thing that our Muslim friends in Afghanistan and the Northern Alliance said. We don't want radical Islamists running Afghanistan. But the Egyptian people did it on their own. It may have been the greatest peaceful uprising in the history of man. Never been that many people peacefully demonstrate. What was not peaceful was the Muslim Brotherhood, because they want the world caliphate. They thought they were on the way with help of President Obama. They were taking Libya. They felt like they were taking Algeria, Tunisia, and come on around North Africa and the Middle East. They were on their way to that world caliphate they were promising they would have. The same world caliphate that the former advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security here in the United States tweeted out after another American had his head cut off, that the international caliphate was inevitable. Americans just needed to get used to the idea. The man that I'd been warning was a Muslim brother and was a top advisor in this administration and needed to be out. Finally, after he made it clear to even the most dense in this administration that he was in favor of an international caliphate, finally they had to let him finish his term and let him go by retiring. Well, the president's still getting that kind of advice. And the truth is that it is a disaster. It has done so much damage to this country. So those who say this is a great deal are the same people that said we had to remove Gaddafi, created massive instability, created a situation where you have so many deaths as people try to flee from North Africa. Where do you think they're coming from? What do you think laid the groundwork for? It was this president's intervention in Libya. This president's meddling in Egypt. We heard the president himself say on national television, international television, because you know ISIS heard it, that ISIS is junior varsity. They're JV. I played on the JV and I played on the varsity, and there's a vast difference. ISIS knew there was a difference. This president did not. He said if we could just arm the vetted, moderate Syrian rebels, then everything would be fine in Syria. We've seen he's created more chaos. He's created tens of thousands of more refugees because of his failed policies born out of massive ignorance, or somebody that's advising him is not ignorant. They know what they're doing. But it is setting the Middle East and North Africa, figuratively speaking, on fire, and in many cases, literally speaking. And we heard over and over of instances where the president's vetted moderate Syrian rebels that we spent millions and millions and millions of dollars training and arming, they kept having all that incredibly upgraded equipment taken over by ISIS. And I've been over there. I've met with the Kurdish commanders. They're begging for up-armored equipment so they can at least have some way to stay on the battlefield with ISIS that this president has armed through the so-called vetted Syrian moderate rebels. Well, we heard tonight that Madeleine Albright thinks this is a good deal. Well, wow, I feel so much better. That's Secretary Albright that said, along with Wendy Sherman that helped negotiate the deal with Iran, that, gee, the key to keeping North Korea from having nuclear weapons is to give them nuclear power plants, give them the nuclear material they need, because they're willing to promise in writing that they won't develop nuclear material or nuclear weapons if we'll do all that for them. Well, that didn't work out so well. People advising this president that were part of the advice, and we hear Madeleine Albright thinks that's a good deal. And then if there was any doubt in any Republican's mind, I don't think there is, but any doubt in any Republican's mind just how horrendous this deal is, that had to be completely dispelled tonight when we heard from our friend on the Democratic side that Hank Paulson, the former Secretary of the Treasury, thinks this is the thing to do. The guy that gave us TARP. The guy that said when we asked, well, if you don't know how much mortgage-backed securities are worth, how do you know you need $700 billion? And in our conference call with other Republicans, the answer to that question was, and I quote, well, we just needed a really big number. That's the guy that we're told tonight is assuring us that this deal with Iran is the way to go. On August 6, 2015, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest, at a White House press briefing, stated, quote, "We don't need Congress to approve this Iran nuclear." July 28, 2015, Secretary Kerry, at a hearing before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, stated the reason why the Iran nuclear agreement is not considered a treaty is because it's become physically impossible to pass a treaty through the United States Senate anymore. It's become impossible to schedule. It's become impossible to pass. But 2 days after Secretary Kerry testified to that was the reason he didn't bring this treaty as a treaty, well, the United States formally ratified the amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material when Henry S. Ensher, the Department of State's ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency, delivered the United States instruments of ratification to the IAEA. Whoops. Turns out Secretary Kerry's testimony by and let the president treat it as if it's been ratified, then Israel will have to defend itself, and under the Iranian treaty, we'll have to defend Iran, not Israel, and the unthinkable will happen, and that is the United States and Iran will be on the same side against Israel. We got to stop that, and with that, I yield back.